This is our agenda for the day that you're welcome to look over. But like I mentioned, we're going to have a few presentations about just how different tenant unions are navigating the legal system, whether they're providing court support or not, and kind of talk through how they're doing it. And then after that, we are going to have some open discussions. So we'll wait and take questions until the end of all the presentations. But if you do have a question, you can feel free to type it into the chat box or write it down so that you don't forget, and we'll get to it at the end. And then I'll also say, we'll talk about this a little more when we get to the discussion, but all the unions that we have today was who was willing and available to volunteer, and they're great unions, but they are all on the West Coast. So I do just want to say, for unions elsewhere, for unions who might have a little bit different conditions, hopefully some of that can come up in the discussion. So please feel free to share what your union is doing as well, because we do just want to have that kind of generative discussion, not just about what our, for example, unions are doing, but what unions are doing, across the continent. And so with that, I think if they're ready, I'm going to go ahead and throw it over to Don't Evict PDX from Portland, who's our first presenters today.
We are ready. Oh, well, I can't speak for my partner. Are we ready? We look ready now. Thanks for having us, everyone. Hold on a second. We are, sorry, slow start here. We are Don't Evict. My name is Cece. I use they, them pronouns. I live up in Portland. And I am joined by another co-founding member, Colleen.
Hello, I'm Colleen. My pronouns are she and her, and I live on Kalapuyan land right outside of what is now known as Portland.
And I am joining you from occupied Chinook lands. We have kind of just addressed this topic by following like 3 questions that were given to us. First being, how is your union interacting with courts and legal aid? Why is your union doing it this way? And what should unions be doing, or what has Don't Evict Portland learned that can help traditional or other tenant unions? And I think we were going to start with talk about our court observation. Colleen, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, so
if you want me to share that thing, just let me know. I have it handy.
Okay, cool. I think yeah. So we are not quote unquote a traditional union. And so I think that bears saying, though. CC, I think we'll get into a lot of what we do to build tenant power. And that is really kind of becomes central to how we interact with the courts. So we began with a small group of 3 folks, and we are we've started our focus on court observation. So here in Oregon, there was a statewide moratorium, except the courts opened up in August, and we didn't understand what that meant. And so the 3 of us were like, well, let's find out how are landlords getting away with evicting people, despite the fact that every newspaper is talking about the moratorium and blah, 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 blah. So we started, and we have continued doing daily observations. So our courts in Multnomah County moved online. Well, they started with a hybrid. So we were doing both in-person observation and online observation in the beginning. As the pandemic changed, we moved to purely online observation. And so we're in that courtroom, every day watching every court proceeding. And so very quickly, we learned a lot about the process. And so I'm going to share this little chart that we did. Let's see if I can screen share. Here we go. It's not going to let me, is it? Cece, can you share that? For some reason Zoom is not letting me, and I don't want to futz with it for too long. Great, thank you. So if you scroll up to the top, so basically we gave ourselves a crash course in tenant defense, legal tenant defense. And that's one of the things that I think is really important to what we do, is we are actually deprofessionalizing lawyers. We're looking at the system as a whole, the process of what it means, what tenants experience through the eviction proceeding. And we are finding the places where tenants themselves or us can interrupt, disrupt, redirect this process. So up at the very top, you'll see summons and notice. Those are slightly different. And now we would probably add some additional things there. But basically, that can go 3 ways. So if you get a notice and your landlord does not intend to go through the court proceeding because they would like to do this illegally, they'll go off to one of those 3 sides, right? They'll harass you, they'll continue to send you illegal notices, and they'll hope that you self-evict or some other, right, other bad scenarios, right? Longer spread chart, flow chart on that side. But for today, we'll focus on what happens in the court. So say you get your notice and then you don't move out at the date that your landlord is requiring you to, or for some other reasons, then you'll get a summons, right? And that's when the court officially takes control, so to speak, right? So with your summons, you'll get your first appearance. So what happens there is where so many tenants get evicted because of what's called default, right? They are not appearing in court that day for any number of many reasons. And landlords are almost always in court, mostly because they're represented, right? We start with this dynamic that landlords are almost always represented and tenants are not. And so just by not showing up, tenants can be found in default, and then that sends them down the default path. I'm not going to go through this in entire detail because it would take our whole 15 minutes, but we're happy to send this out. But the most important thing is each of these arrows and these loops are possibilities for slowing down, interrupting, or disrupting an eviction process, right? And so for us, that's what our focus is. We see eviction defense to include stopping, delaying, or reducing the harms of eviction. Each one of these is an opportunity. And so getting to know this flowchart and understanding it, and so when a tenant reaches out to you and says, I'm headed to my non-compliance hearing, you know what that means and you know what your options are. And again, with that concept of participating in and partnering with like comrade lawyers, which we'll talk about, but not relying on them. We are growing for our members who are all tenants. We're growing our ability to be in this process. And with the tenants who reach out to us who are not yet a part of like our union or our group or other groups, they are also empowered and skilled. Like we're about sharing skills, right? And the courts will do everything they can to not share that knowledge, right? Judges will say the wrong thing about how to file evidence. They'll say, the wrong thing about this. Clerks vary, right? We have found, like, also that's the other thing, by doing this every day, showing up every day, we know which clerks are going to be our fucking comrades. Like when it comes right down to it, which are obstructionists or which are comrades. And so we know more because we spend our time at the site of where this violence is rooted. So yeah, I think that's that. Like I said, we could go through that. That could be a whole thing, but also we can send that out. So Cece, if you want to stop sharing. And then another thing, so we're taking notes, we're recording data, we keep our own track. We therefore don't have to rely on the court's really bad documentation process to understand where somebody is in their process. We keep our own notes and then we share that out. If you go to our Twitter feed, that is a massive part of what we do. We talk about what we see in court, which is not being recorded anywhere else. We're able to document that, just like racism, transphobia, shitty behavior, misogyny, all of that, that's not going to be recorded anywhere else. But we're seeing it and we can document it. And then the other thing I would say about court observation is it is the most radicalizing thing that I've experienced in how I communicate with people who want to get involved in the group, right? Like they talk to us, they hear what we're doing, and they're like, oh, that seems cool. Like genuine, right? I'm not trying to be a dick about it, but like genuinely people are like, yeah, supporting tenants. I'm a tenant. I want to get involved. They spend 3 days in court and they're like, burn this fucking thing to the ground. It is and mutual aid is rad. And if that's your jam, like that is also our jam. But there's something about moving from a feeling and being centered from a position of like, yes, we can be in relationship with the system and working within it, to being like, this is It is not enough to say that it is stacked. And so, yeah, I just think that for people who are coming into wanting to participate in this, putting them in that courtroom for a couple of days is the best thing you can do. And then the last thing I'll say about that is right now we are entirely online, and use that to your benefit. When we were in the courtroom, to be disruptive, right? Like you're in the house of the fucking law. The sheriffs are right there. They will come and snatch you out immediately. They can't do that when you're online. So we are so much more disruptive because all they can do is kick us out and then we dial back in. And so use that to your advantage. We are a pain in the judge's ass and he can't do anything about it.
So with that, I'm going to talk about some of the things we do beyond observation and radicalization. As you've heard, Colleen mentioned court disruption. So, I won't touch on that too much because I think we've kind of seen, a lot of us here have seen some of the actions of KC Tenants, and we have taken cues from them, in fact, learned from them, and we have launched disruptions on that level. I'd say that one of the things we bring to that table is a heavy sound effects and synthesis component. We have a lot of creative people. I think there's creative people in every city, and actually this is a pretty good way to get people involved. Like people are really willing to do something disruptive if it's kind of safe from their own home and online. Another thing we do is we access court information on a daily basis. And we use this information to do outreach with tenants. Recent estimates from local law center says that about 1/3 of notices are fraudulent or facially invalid. That's not all we look for. A lot of times during the moratorium, there were spikes of 24-hour outrageous act notices. And sometimes we could see that maybe this doesn't seem right or it's totally false. And, either from outreach or from hearing from a tenant who had one of these 24-hour notice, a lot of times they were just totally fraudulent. And that kind of outreach brings us to why are we doing this? And that was from an analysis that happened while we started our group, which was during an eviction moratorium, as Colleen mentioned, and we were just curious about why people are still getting evicted. And what kind of space does that place tenants in? And like in Portland, I would almost say most of Portland is dominated by duplex style or single family housing. And there just really isn't a lot of large apartment complexes. And this kind of physical layout does affect the power that you have if you withhold or act in unison with your neighbors. And then also we just started thinking about not everyone can access organizing with their neighbors. Not everyone, or also that shouldn't be the only way tenants can access, learning their rights and using their rights to make things better for their own lives. And also when people come to us frequently, they do pass on things they learn. So that has led us to, using court information to, do pinpointed outreach, has led us to all kinds of opportunities that are closer to kind of quote unquote traditional tenant organizing. For instance, six evictions happen at one complex. We would probably send someone or a team from our outreach team to go talk to people at that complex. Another thing is that because we're affirmative with outreach, people are starting to find us through that. And I know that's nothing new to most tenant associations, and because we have developed relations with a comrade lawyer or two, we've actually had people hit up lawyers, and then lawyers who we know and have good trusted relationships with actually say, you don't really need a lawyer in this instance, but let me get you in conversation with people at Don't Evict, because one of the things we recognize and push is an expansion of what eviction defense can mean. And I think many people here in this meeting probably are familiar with the Red House in Portland. And we were starting to really come together at around that time. Red House was happening here. And we weren't against any of the thinking of Red House. We did notice some things, and, you know, we wanted to expand what people were given from the Red House as terms of like what they could conceptualize eviction defense being. You know, one clear thing is that you can't have a Red House every time there's an eviction. That's just impossible. So, you know, we began to talk about how tenant organizing is an eviction defense. And like Colleen said, deprofessionalizing, I think what a lot of people would categorize in eviction defense as being left up to lawyers or legal professionals. Now, one of the examples of this would be, we are working with a group of tenants in a manufactured home park in Johnson City, Oregon, which is south of here. And the city itself is its own, the city is just the mobile home park. And the city leases the streets from the park, and we found all kinds. So like, without a lawyer that we had developed a relationship with, we kind of would have missed out a lot of the organizing opportunities that are available there, because they extend beyond just building the tenant association with these tenants. They actually have access to power in their own city. And like, with some legal help, there's, you know, it could be a scenario where the tenants actually become part of the city government and, you know, seize control of their entire, like, you know, and there's just this one family who like controls it all through, well, anyone here who's worked with like a lawyer or landlords knows how landlords control situations. And yeah. So those are kind of some of the reasons why we would do this. Another huge one is like, beyond just like people who don't have access to collectivization. Another aspect of that are like situations in where one landlord controls, you know, 4 units in the house. And this is really prevalent in Portland. And like, due to those conditions, and due to abuse from those landlords, like those tenants are too afraid to work together. And even though they're in close proximity, like they really need in a weird like anonymity to their organizing, and they need to like organize away from their house due to this unsafe situation. So we've actually worked with a lot of people like that. And in all these cases, whether they're legit actions or not, or lawful or unlawful actions of these mom and pop landlords, and these are mom and pop landlords, they use the specter, imagery, and invocation of the court. We worked with a tenant the other month, and their landlord was just like, I'm going to kick you out in 5 days. But he used like what he thought were like notices, like he made them in permanent markers so that they were real, but like, you know, that he's still invoking the court. And like that kind of just, you know, cements our belief that like the court is like the tool, like, you know, and a lot of us have read about like how courts were given to landlords to like kind of get them to stop evicting people at gunpoint. Like they took the gun out of landlord's tool and gave them the court. So, you know, that's one of the things we organize around. And another reason we do this is because like we do we do see a future in which like we can change the actual conditions for everyone on the ground to make organizing something that doesn't invoke risk for tenants. And you know, that's something we want to see in our future as well. And because of that, we are engaging in all kinds of things that spread out from the court, but do involve policy maybe in other ways. And I would pass the mic back over to Colleen at this point.
Thanks, Cece. Yeah, so the last question kind of is like, what have we learned that can be useful to traditional tenants unions, or what should unions be doing? And definitely not here to tell you what you should be doing, but what we have found really, really useful about the process of organizing at the site of evictions at the site of the courts are 2 things primarily. One is that it really helps us to cement our understanding, expand our understanding, and then our communications about what we see as the 2 points that landlords need to continue to exist, right? Which is both power and profit. So often the conversation tries to get narrowed into one or the other, and really it's about both, right? And so if it's when we talk about, when landlords try and talk about themselves as housing providers, right? The whole commodification thing is, it's a business. It's just a business between me and you, and this is a business thing, and it's not, right? And we absolutely know that. And one way that we can continue to push and chip away at that is talking about the control and power that landlords exert in a way that other businesses don't. Like, the law has not provided that. Like, sure, they probably love it, but that hasn't been provided to them. And we have carved out an entire section of our legal system to cement the control of other people's lives in the hands of individuals and corporations. And that becomes more and more clear when we talk about the legal system, as opposed to just, from in my experience, when it is about me and my landlord, or me and my neighbors and my landlord, it feels like a personal relationship, and or like we can talk about it as a business contract, but we lose sight of the larger power, like power and control, power over, not just power, but power over and control. And so when we keep those, so when people say, well, why did a landlord do this? And they're looking for a profit answer, but not looking for a power control answer, this allows us to talk about both, and or the other way, right? Well, this doesn't make any sense. You've ceded some small amount of power over me, but you've increased your profit. So if we continue to analyze through both of those lenses simultaneously, we have a much better picture. And then the last part, including that, is that my sense of what we're doing in the courtrooms is that we are the way that protesters will often talk about turning cameras on cops instead of protesters. We've taken that model and moved it into the courtrooms. Our goal is not to shine a light on what each individual tenant who moves through that process is doing, right? We're not going to talk about their experiences without their consent, but we damn well will talk about what the judges are doing, what landlords are doing, and the lawyers are doing without their consent, because they are a class of people that we are in conflict with. We will turn our cameras to them, and we will shine a light on their behavior every day and always, because it is not about any individual landlord. Some may be worse than others, and that's fine, but it's actually about them as a class. And we lump, and not lump, but we are accurate in our assessment that they are not operating alone. This is not a bilateral conflict between landlords and tenants. We are maybe the two people at the two classes at the front lines, but that's not a full picture of the fight, because behind every landlord is a judge and a law enforcement officer, and really those entire groups of those people. So if we are looking at our fight from looking for the full picture and to understand where the access points, where the vulnerabilities, and where the power points are, we have to understand that landlords operate knowing that behind them is every judge and every cop. And so if we remove that from our view and reframe this as like all of the tenants that operate or live under the conditions that this landlord has placed, we are actually individualizing that landlord and targeting them as a singular business or a singular person, when in fact, we need to be seeing them like all landlords, right? Like all landlords are bastards, I'm sorry. And we have to remind ourselves that they operate in collusion and in cohorts and in a veiled way. They would like us to not see that power that they are hoarding. And so we have to be reminding ourselves that these systems are interlocking and they require each other. So that's why we show up. And that's the last part, is like, we don't see the courts as being a place where we can seek justice, but it's where we can interrupt the injustices that are happening with the most ease and the most reliability. We are reliably annoying to these judges and to the lawyers. Yeah. So that's why, one of the reasons we think that it is crucial to be doing this work.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cece and Colleen. Again, and for folks who joined us, we're going to have a lot of time for questions and discussion at the end. So if you've got a question that hasn't been answered by their presentation, you can type it in the chat if you want, or just write it down so you can ask at the end. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Kitty and Elliot, I believe, from.
Okay. Excuse me. Give me a second here. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, Lord. I have to put it in presentation mode. Okay. Oh, God.
You got this, Elliot.
What have I done? Okay, presentation mode. I don't know how I can, hold on. The order of operations here is unclear. Stand by. Okay, let me share screen first and then presentation mode. Okay, can y'all see it?
Looks great.
Cool. So hi, I'm Elliot, and this is
Kitty?
and we're from the Sacramento Tenants Union, here to talk with you a little bit about navigating the organizer-lawyer relationship, at least as it relates to Sacramento. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about, well, first we're going to go over the big picture, some sort of like overall concepts and ideas that we use to help frame our collaboration and work with attorneys. We're going to talk about some best practices, and then we're going to talk about a couple of quick case studies of like our experience with a couple of experiences we've had working with lawyers here in town and the various outcomes.
Yeah, so I guess the first kind of big picture thing we wanted to talk about is how we think about organizing versus counseling or mutual aid, in the sense of just sort of like random people showing up to support a person who to them is a random tenant in need. And when we got, I guess, when we sort of got going as a tenants union and we were getting calls from people who were dealing with issues with their landlord and looking for help, we sort of rattled through for a long time, and this is how we've come to think about it. So, you know, organizing would be like somebody calls you, their landlord's raising their rent, and they live in a big apartment, and there's the potential for like them to talk to their neighbors and there to be collective pushback against the landlord to like win good things for the tenants, right? Which we feel like is great. Like obviously that can, you know, as I'm sure most of us have experienced, like tenants banding together and making demands straight from the landlord is a pretty good way to get good outcomes for themselves. And additionally, doing that has the potential to grow and strengthen like a tenants union as an organization, right? Because people get organized, they win, they get skills. Kind of in contrast to that, something we also sometimes find ourselves doing is something that's more along the lines of like a peer counseling, tenants' rights counseling type of thing. And what we have found is that that can be pretty time and like emotionally involved, time intensive and emotionally involved for our core members, right? Because people are like calling you with these really intractable problems and often need a lot of support. And that so far, even though maybe you could imagine a model where people who in the past have been the beneficiary of like mutual aid action on their behalf would in turn like be down to show it for someone else. Most of the time, if we end up doing organizing-ish things where there's a big action directly against the landlord, it's just relying on sending out a call to the existing kind of activist network in Sacramento to show up and do an action. And so, you know, thinking about that, it's like, oh, we want to work less on the counseling side of things, which is where we find ourselves most often working with lawyers. But at the same time, like a lot of the time, the most serious, like urgent calls that we get from people are from folks that are calling in circumstances where it's hard to imagine readily moving them into an organizing kind of model, right? Like maybe they're living in a single family home, maybe they just have a really time sensitive issue and they don't have time to spend like weeks canvassing all the other apartments in their complex and like getting neighbors on board. Maybe they just have other stuff going on in their lives and don't have like the personal ability or capacity to organize, at least at the time. And it feels pretty terrible to be like, sorry, we're only interested in helping people where they might be able to organize, like go call someone else, right? So we still find ourselves doing both organizing and counseling as a union.
Apparently I put some animations on that one. I didn't remember doing that. So a little bit more about the counseling that we do here with the union. So counseling is, we feel, an opportunity, but it can also be, as Kitty was explaining, quite a burden as well. So you have to be careful and strategic about how you do it. So Counseling for us is actually an opportunity to move people into a more organizing model, at least if there's enough time to make that happen. While you talk to people and you counsel them through your problem, through their issue, whatever it is, the realization, kind of like Colleen was talking about with the courts, like the radicalization that you get going to like a court support sort of thing. The realization of the radicalization we hope people have at the end of the conversation is like, okay, there's like 2 laws that maybe might protect me, but in general, this system is really fucked. And I need to get with my neighbors and get with my community and build tenant solidarity in order to win. That's not always the outcome, but that's sort of the hope. Also, because legal organizations in Sacramento are stretched so incredibly thin, people often get turned away, at least on the first try. And so they often come to us as like a last resort. And like Kitty was saying, we feel it's sort of like not really ethical to just like kick those people to the curb. So we do our best to counsel them and give them whatever assistance we can. And also and this is what we're going to get into a little bit later as well and expound on it some more, but we find that by collaborating with the tenant, counseling them through their problem, and then sort of transitioning them to a legal organization or a lawyer, that can help them first. They get like a base of like their rights. So they already have like extra added knowledge that they didn't have before. But also we find that crafting like a story or crafting a narrative is very important when a tenant reaches out to an organization that is already so extremely strapped for resources. If you come to them with like a frantic email that's like 8 paragraphs long and all over the place, you know, that attorney already has 40 clients. They're going to be like, delete. But if you help them craft a story, as sad as it is, it can be much more effective in getting somebody on their side if they needed an attorney to do so.
Okay, so kind of going down the counseling road, like what are the ways that, what's the spectrum of ways that we can support tenants if it doesn't seem immediately viable to be like, go talk to your neighbors and organize against your landlord. And like Elliot just talked about, the counseling is a big part of that. And the huge advantage to running a peer counseling program, in addition to what Elliot said, is of course that it's an unfunded autonomous thing, right? Like we just have a Google Voice number and we call people back. And so that's, you know, that's how that works. In contrast, those nonprofit legal services, they're often foundation funded, they're potentially government funded. And so there's just, even if there's not strings attached, there's more kind of like parameters for the ways that they can engage with people. And that's something that we run up against a lot. It's like even tenants that have really worthy legal issues, if it's sort of outside of the realm of engagement for an organization, they might not take on that case. And then similarly, in some places, there are also like government run legal aid programs, or we have this weird thing that isn't even a legal aid organization called the Tenant Protection Program that's run by our city. That's just like the most useless, hateful organization I've ever encountered. But anyway, those are also usually like, right, they're funded by the government. And actually a lot of them, like in our case, the California Apartment Association actually puts up money to run some of these programs. And so that really, you have to like kind of look into those things and question, like if a landlord / realtor lobby organization is paying for this ostensibly like tenant right legal aid program, how much help are tenants really getting? What are they going to be encouraging their staff to do? So those two in the middle, you know, like you have to look a little below the surface to decide what kind of help you might be getting. And then the final option in terms of like where do you go to get support is of course just to like find a lawyer on your own, or for a tenant to find a lawyer on their own. And that usually costs money. You can, in some cases, for strong cases, lawyers will do something called take a case on contingency. And what that means is like, I don't know, like let's say that like through gross negligence, there was a fire at a tenant's house and all their crap was destroyed, and now the landlord is like trying to evict them rather than like take responsibility for the fact that a fire caused the tenant to lose all their belongings, right? A lawyer might decide like, we have a great case here, let's just sue the landlord. And then instead of having to pay the lawyer up front, you would get money, the lawyer would get money from the lawsuit at the end if they win. So sometimes that's an option for people who are like cash strapped but have a good case. But that's sort of like the landscape of possible ways to get legal help of some type as a tenant with an issue. At least that's what we found.
And I just add on that last point too, like at least in Sacramento, the tenant attorneys are rare if they exist at all. And pretty much all of them also, they're really like real estate attorneys. So
Yeah.
they usually also represent landlords. So that's the strength of the defense that you're going to be getting if you hire one of these folks in town. It's like half the time they're going to be like, well, you got to be reasonable. Look at it from the landlord's perspective. They got to make a living, you know? And yeah, so a lot of times it's not even worth wasting your money or time. But okay, so a couple points we want to make. And I don't want to make this like a dunk fest on lawyers and attorneys. There are some great ones. Don't Evict was talking about some like solidarity lawyers that they organize with. We don't really have that sort of relationship here in Sacramento because again, there are so few like, I don't know, activist attorneys active in the community. But so we have some lessons learned that we wanted to share with you is all I'm saying, without making a blanket statement about all lawyers. So be aware that even lawyers make mistakes. And so we having interacted with tenants and these various organizations over time, you get a flavor for like who's reliable and who knows what they're talking about. Kitty mentioned earlier our city's laughably inadequate tenant protection program. They have the city attorney and some of their staff working with them, and tenants regularly call them with questions and get like wrong answers, just straight up like incorrect answers. And these are supposedly like trained professionals. So just beware of like when you're referring people to an organization, be mindful of whether the organization will be giving that tenant useful information. Also avoid flaky outfits, especially if it's something time sensitive. So I guess flaky may be unfair here. I think a lot of organizations are just completely overwhelmed in Sacramento and probably in many other places as well. But it turns out that there are organizations where we refer someone to, and then they call us back a day later saying, hey, or 2 days or 3 days later saying, I tried them 5 times, no one ever got back to me. And now it's like the 11th and a half hour, and they're about to have, you know, some serious legal consequences. And then it's an even greater crisis where if we had a reliable partner that we had referred them to in the first place, we wouldn't be scrambling as much in the end. Legal organizations have specific strategies. So for example, in Sacramento, many free legal aid orgs are really good at filing paperwork, court documents, filing responses and all these things, but they don't generally go to court. So if it's a tenant who says like, I've got a case and it's a juicy one, you know, like there's mold all over my apartment and they owe me all this money, and there's obviously like all this stuff that they wanted, that the tenant wants to do. Just let them know that like if you go to the free legal aid, they're gonna like say, well, if you have an eviction, let us know, but otherwise I don't think there's much we can do for you. So just be honest and upfront with them in that way. And again, like I was saying earlier, legal resources in SAC are really scant. So even if you wanted to refer every tenant to a lawyer, realistically, only a small fraction of the tenants who would need a lawyer are actually going to get assistance. So again, that's not to say that attorneys are like bad or whatever. I think they're really overstretched here. And this means that the organizing and interpersonal like solidarity building that we want to engage in is even more crucial.
All right, so this is kind of our way of thinking about like when do we go to lawyers if we can find them, or legal aid organizations, and when do we not? And so the first one, like Elliot was just kind of talking about, is there's some things, at least in California, some answers, that's the phrase for it, that you need to file with the court, that it's like really handy to have a lawyer who understands what the difference between like a motion to quash and a motion to demur is, right? And so if somebody calls us and they're like, I just got this court summons, what do I do? We just say, try and get a hold of legal aid and get them to help you file that answer with the court. We also sometimes will do that if the case is really egregious and kind of like, I think especially stuff that might require more sort of like affirmative litigation, right? Where like the landlord is doing some shitty stuff, and actually what needs to happen is like somebody needs to sue them to get them to do the right thing, or to organize against them. But like we talked about, sometimes, you know, especially people who are sort of more isolated might just not have like the people power to have leverage to organize. And that kind of leads into the next point of like, what have we found has little organized potential? Sometimes we get calls from people who are like, you know, in rural parts of Northern California, like hours away from us, and don't have access to any kind of organization like close to them that could support them. Also, like, yeah, folks that live in single family homes. Sometimes we get calls from people who are like more conservative and anti-union, even though they're like being screwed over by capitalism, basically. Or also we get folks who kind of, after multiple attempts, struggle to grasp the distinction between a union and a service organization. You know, like people will call us and ask to talk to our staff, or like meet in our offices, and we'll try and explain like, we're a union, we're autonomous, we're just a bunch of volunteers. And if people really struggle with that like distinction, sometimes we just try and like direct them to an actual service organization. Another case where we've found that it's helpful to work with lawyers is to add, Elliot put it in quotes, gravitas. And so, you know, sometimes like, even if you don't really need a lawyer, you're just writing a mean letter to like a landlord or to the city, sometimes having a lawyer sign on or coach what you already had to say in legalese can help intimidate those people. So if you can find someone that's willing to help you do that, that can help without even requiring like kind of actual lawyer skills like a lawsuit. And then lastly, eviction court. We have no form of right to counsel in Sacramento. So usually, just like the folks in Portland we're talking about, landlords show up with representation in eviction court and tenants don't, and tenants almost always lose. And so we always strongly encourage people to get representation in court if they possibly can. Because it's just, even I've seen tons of people with good cases lose in court if they're representing themselves, because it's just a terrible shit show that's stacked against us all, as Colleen talked about.
Okay, so real quickly, we're going to go over a couple of case studies. These are sort of like real world exercises and things that have happened to us when we were trying to navigate this organizer-lawyer relationship and how things ended up. So sorry, it's a little bit wordy here, but the first one more or less is tenant calls our tenant counseling hotline in distress. They have received a 5-day notice and they fear for an oncoming or impending eviction. So as Kitty just mentioned, when it comes to evictions, we don't really mess around. We always advise people, if they can, to get legal representation. So we advise them to contact a legal aid organization here in town to get assistance completing the response to their 5-day notice, and then go from there. So the tenant contacts legal aid, but is not followed up with. Tenant contacts us again a little bit after the fact in a panic once again. So we work with them to craft another response so we can reach back out to the legal aid organization together, like in unison. So it's like not just the tenant, it's like the Sacramento Tenants Union also wants this tenant to get some help. Finally, legal aid responds, but they're at the last moment to respond to this 5-day notice. So there's like a panic, right? They get the 5-day notice back in the mail, and the tenant says, what's next? Well, the legal aid organization says, unfortunately, there's nothing we can do for you right now. So let us know if you get an eviction notice in the mail. So then there's this like horrible like waiting period, this gray area where the tenant's like, am I going to get a suit from the court? Are they going to drop it? What's happening? I don't have an attorney. I had one for a day, but then they said they couldn't help me. And what's the result of all of this, like back and forth referral nonsense without building any actual tenant power? Well, the tenant now has very little faith in the Sacramento Tenants Union, very little faith in legal aid, and very little hope concerning their own safety and security going forward. So really, it's a lose-lose-lose situation when that happens. And that's why it's so crucial that if you are ever referring people to collaborate with an attorney, that you are confident that that attorney has the capacity, the knowledge, and the skills to actually help. So a couple lessons learned from this: seek to organize even when it isn't convenient. Like Kitty was talking about, sometimes we get calls from very far afield, you know, from like the Central Valley all the way up to the Oregon coast. And obviously we can't drive like 5 hours to help people organize their building. But if it's a little bit outside of your comfort zone and your first instinct is like, we don't have the time or capacity for this, and it sounds like a legal issue, maybe try to bring that person on board, get them, talking about organizing with their neighbors, and see if you can go from there. Also, it's a good idea for members of your union to have some of those basic legal skills to, there we go, to be able to answer like basic 5-day notices, or like Colleen and Cece were saying earlier, to kind of like deprofessionalize or demystify the system for tenants. So when you're working with them, you can explain like, this is the way an eviction works, because a lot of people get a 3-day pay or quit notice in California, which is like the initial notice that a landlord uses. And they think, I got 3 days to be out. And it's important you have the knowledge to say like, pause, hold on, wait, 3-day pay or quit does not mean you're being evicted. There's a whole process that has to go on here, and we can organize around this. So those are a couple lessons.
Okay, a second case study that is maybe a little more generous to the potential of lawyers to support the work we're doing is at the end of last year, we got contacted by a bunch of different families who are all living in this extended stay hotel, and they all got no fault eviction notices. So basically they got paperwork saying you have to move out in 60 days. And it was a complicated case because because of the extended stay hotel, it was like, do these people count as tenants? Are they still lodgers? What unit type is this under all of these different overlapping and also ambiguous state and local and COVID laws and protections around just cause eviction? And so yeah, it was kind of a tricky case. And what ultimately had to happen was the residents there did a bunch of organizing. They got together and like basically write some demand letters and stuff. We did like a kind of public pressure campaign against the city because what we needed to do was have the city attorney investigate the owner of the property and their like alleged need to do this mass eviction. And in that case, we were able to get our local like legal service organization to help us first help us understand, like wade through all of these complicated things and understand like what's a legitimate argument that we could make as to why these were bogus evictions. And then they also helped us like draft letters and communications to the city attorney, kind of like what we were talking about before, adding a little bit of that like gravitas to the communications and kind of signaling like, these aren't just some like crazy activists that think that this is wrong. This is actually wrong from a legal standpoint. And that actually ended up being like a fairly successful case. The notices got withdrawn. I think they wanted to demolish the hotel, and I think they eventually got like a demolition permit and reissued the notices. But at the time those people got their first notices, none of that had happened. Like there were no credible plans to do anything with the motel. People didn't need to move out. And so that was a great opportunity, I guess, to use a legal aid to help us. To answer people's questions about just cause, it's very complicated. It's like the city says one thing, the state says another thing. It's hard to tell who's covered by what. And that was one of the things that we needed the help of the legal organization to like figure out what could go on there. Anyway, yeah. So that was a more successful lean on the lawyers.
Yeah, I would say that was a highly successful one, actually, and much credit to many other organizers as well in the city who worked on this. Mm-hmm. They went and canvassed, they went and did outreach, they wrote correspondence, they collaborated with a number of different orgs in town. And I think, if I recall correctly, this was all around like Thanksgiving time. Is that right, Kitty?
Yeah.
I think that was that just happened to be, the timing just happened to be on our side because people were particularly outraged, all these like comfortable like liberals in Sacramento. They're like, eviction is fine, but
Right
on
before Christmas?
Thanksgiving,
Yeah.
you can't possibly. So it got people that probably would have ignored this even more outraged, and that worked heavily in their favor. Okay, so real quickly, just to sum up, and then we'll quit talking your ears off here. What have we learned by collaborating, working with, and working around legal organizations and attorneys here in Sacramento? Well, first and foremost, and obviously I'm preaching to the choir, but the power of our movement lies in our ability to join tenants together and struggle against an oppressive capitalist class. So organizing, organizing, organizing. We want to build solidarity and tenant power together. That's our primary goal, our primary focus. But however, at times, like Kitty was saying earlier, there's little organizing opportunity. So people that live rurally, for example, unfortunately, they don't have a bunch of neighbors to come and help them organize, or people that live outside of the range of our organization, we can't really do some in-person one-on-one organizing. So what's important to do in those cases is be honest and upfront about the tenants who contact you. Let them know, like, look, I don't think there's much that the union can do for you. There are a few organizations in town who may be able to help, but here are their limitations, and be aware of them. I also prioritize your work effectively. So like it has been the case in the past, the SAC Tenants Union gave 110% to every single person who called our hotline. And I'm telling you now, as many of you probably already know, that's a recipe for burnout, disillusionment, like the whole gambit. It's no good. So prioritize the cases according to where you think the attention needs to be given. Build relationships with trusted legal professionals, especially in a town like Sacramento where there are so few of them. You want to foster that sort of collaboration. Again, help tenants craft a narrative before referring to legal services, and when possible, offer a warm handoff. So like help them tell their story to an attorney, because an attorney is all about telling stories, really, or many of them are anyway. It's not just about filing court documents. So help them tell their story. And then if you have that relationship with those legal professionals, help transition them by giving them like a little boost, hey, we'll reach out to this person on your behalf. Let us know if you hear back, that kind of thing. And again, avoid getting corralled into the nonprofit model. Maintain your autonomy and focus on building tenant solidarity whenever possible. So don't let this work detract from your organizing, more or less. And I think that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elliot and Kitty. That was a lot of really good tips and advice in there, I think. And I do just want to acknowledge that we're going a little bit over time on the presentations, but I am really getting a lot out of them. And from the responses in the chat, it looks like everybody is. So if everyone's okay with it, we're just going to keep going through these presentations. We'll still have plenty of time for discussion at the end. Of course, it's a Zoom meeting. If anybody has to go, you're welcome to, and we will, again, have the recording posted after this. But just want to acknowledge that, and then I will go ahead and pass it over to Santa Barbara Tenants Union.
Cool. Hi. Is that it? I just talk now? Okay, cool. So apologize in advance. It was a little bit short notice and I didn't put together a PowerPoint or anything. So it's going to be a little less like aesthetically pleasing for folks. But so I'm just going to kind of go over verbally a really unique situation for our union, which we formed like a lot of the newer ones in North America kind of shortly after the pandemic, when kind of like the sort of like internet hashtag stuff was going on. And we modeled off of Tank a little bit in terms of just like we saw they're like how to form a tenants council. We stupidly didn't realize that was a single building, and we were like, oh, we're a tenants union now. And so we've been building for like the last year plus. And it's been really good. But so what I'll share kind of primarily is actually a sort of a confusing built-in feature that we've had with our union for the last year, which we're now calling Legal Help Desk, which is run by a legal aid attorney who is a member of our tenants union, who is very sort of left-leaning politically, had some involvement with LATU like years ago, and is just within the sort of like left progressive, you know, whatever kind of like, you know, solidarity lawyer kind of vibe. So I'll just share kind of the trajectory, like the story of like how he got involved, how we set up this essentially this confused thing where it's like a sort of service and a sort of like base building tactics simultaneously that has a lot of pros and a lot of cons built in for us. And then I want to ask in a minute, like whether folks would have gone this route or not. So let me first describe the thing. So we formed, it had been like 1 or 2 weeks, and we got our socials and stuff, and we're like, hey, we're a tenants union, come talk to us, we're doing stuff. And then this lawyer kind of popped into one of our meetings one time and just said like, hey, I'm a lawyer, I work for legal aid, and I'm down, like I will help you guys out however possible. And also just so you know, there's actually like a grant that would fund me working with you, that would actually give me billable hours to actually like prioritize work with your union. That was basically the government seizing money from Wells Fargo from a settlement from the mortgage crisis. So it's just money sitting around that's supposed to be used to help people who've been screwed over by like the for-profit housing system. And so we didn't actually have a lot of internal debate. I don't think we were like ideologically unified at that time, and we still have debate on like kind of the nonprofit industrial complex like conversation. So we didn't really talk very critically about it. I think we were so new, and we really just wanted to do anything that we were just like, let's just work with this guy. Like, why not? Like, what could go wrong, you know? And I'm not going to say like, yeah, and then everything fell apart, and like now we're like not autonomous and we suck now. It actually has been pretty good, but we discussed it early on, and actually inspired mostly by Autun's weekly organizing office hours. We were like, why don't we set up a sort of like legal, like an almost legal clinic office hours thing where this attorney could just answer questions for folks. Like they'll just pop in on Zoom. They'll know that it's out there, and like we can pop in and we can be like, let's organize and stuff too. So it could actually be a collaborative thing. And we've actually been doing that weekly for like a year now. And so I have so many mixed feelings about it, but let me just maybe ask like either show of hands or the comments. If this situation happened for you guys for your union, if a lawyer popped up and was like, I'm just down to like basically be a built-in feature of the union, and I'll do this like hour that's actually run by the union, not really legal aid. Like maybe just like thumbs up if you would do it, if you'd have it built into your union. I don't know, you could say no in the comments if you want. I'm just curious as like a sort of, yeah, probably would have tried it. Yeah. Okay, cool. Make the lawyer donate half their billable. Damn, that's a good idea. We should talk about that with them, actually. I know it's like, it's going from like the state seizing from Wells Fargo to seizing to legal aid to his account, and then back to the union to like, you know, he is paying our highest income grade of dues now, actually, which I think is dope. So that's, we modeled that also off of Tank, which is dope. So, okay, cool. I'm just looking at the comments. So anyway, so I just wanted to generate this question because I think like when we talk about the complexities of like how our movements can be sort of shaped to be less autonomous, like this is a perfect example of something that can very much shape your union to just begin to look like or function like a legal clinic or something. And then I think what Katie brought up, right, this confusion that still comes up for them, like if SAC is very much like we're an autonomous tenants union, and like they're having the issue of people being like, service, we need services, where are your professionals, where's your office? Like building this into our union has created that, like totally created that problem. So, because if your sort of entry point into our union is the legal help desk thing, from that point forward, like you don't even know about our general meetings. You don't know that like we'll knock doors in your building, we'll do demand letters and like all the, you know, like phone zaps and like all the organizing stuff and direct action, like because he's he has to be a little bit careful. The kind of the issue here is like, he might have more sort of left politics and stuff. And he might think like, I'd rather all these people just sort of take risks and go on rent strike and for me to defend them once it goes down. Like he probably wouldn't verbally articulate that, but that's probably politically what he would want for everyone to be doing. But he is like, because he's sort of doing like nonprofit billable hours, like he has to be functioning like an employee of a nonprofit that has all the kind of general constraints that a nonprofit organization has, right? With all the funding and structure and legal problems. So, yeah, so not letting him work alone. The other issue, it's 5:30 to 6:30 every Thursday. Like I work then, so I can't go. Most other people can't. We had a member who is now studying for the bar. She went to law school and she's been doing tenant advocacy forever. She was sort of like facilitating for a while, and we're trying to get other tenants, but like he actually is in there alone most weeks because we actually can't be in there. So, so sorry, I'm like reading the comments. There's a lot of comments. So yeah, so as a lawyer doing tenant counseling. So he actually makes really clear, he's like, first, like, I'm not your lawyer and this isn't legal advice, this is legal information. So I'd say that the biggest sort of pro to having legal help desk is that because he's, you know, an actual lawyer in quotes, like, and like he does mainly eviction defense, like that's basically all he does. He actually knows some of the finer points, like no matter how much any of us would study stuff, like since he sees it day to day, there's little nuanced things of how the court system works and everything that he just knows like way better than any of us would. So when someone is asking him a question, he's like, well, actually, this is how that works. And then so but he's also really careful where he's just like, I can't tell you what to do. This is like the most frustrating part of it, where unless one of us are there, like in an organizing capacity, to be like, oh, well, you know, how many units is your building? Where is it? We can come knock doors with you, or you want to have a separate meeting later to talk? So we can like, because now that you kind of know anyone that's read the Autonomous Tenants Union, the Chicago zine, the like Tactics Volume 1 thing, where it has this beautiful sort of phrase that's like, rights are the shield and organizing is the sword sort of thing, or like direct action tactics or whatever you want to call it is the sword. This lawyer can only act as to give information about what flimsy ass shields we have available to us. That's all they can do. Like legally, they can't do anything else unless they actually became the lawyer. So, so the main pros, I'd say, consistent, weekly, far more accurate than usually I mean, he has made some mistakes. And I think the other thing to throw in there is just like how fucking burnt out like these lawyers are, like whether you're a public defender, like a nonprofit eviction defense lawyer or whatever, like the caseloads are so high, they're probably underpaid, you know, they're underpaid compared to if they did corporate law and everything. And they're just, there's way more, anybody that knows kind of like what happened as like the welfare state got like destroyed over the last 50 years and nonprofits sort of started filling that role. Legal aid foundations are doing what we would if we had like a robot, like the state doing what it should do. Like it's up to them to be taking care of people in this way, but there's so few of them. So anyway, you guys all understand this. So he does make mistakes. He's burnt out. Sometimes like he's had to take days off. Sometimes he's just like your job, like you have to take days off from your work. So he's like, I have to like not get the billable hours today. So the main, I'd say cons to this have been the minute that people know that we have a lawyer in the union, that's like a built-in feature of the union, many people, if not most people, are like, where's the lawyer? Give me the lawyer. I need to talk to the lawyer. And we're like, no. Like we have to clarify really quickly, like we'll get to the lawyer piece, but we need to kind of explain to you who we are and what we do. And it's actually made it harder to explain who we are and what we do as a result of having this built into the union. We've tried to kind of bifurcate stuff and say like, as a tenants union, like I've started using this phrase and some of us, we all use different messaging depending on how we talk to people, but I'll say like, so there's a difference between say charity and solidarity. Charity is like what we're used to, all the billions of nonprofits in Santa Barbara. They're like, they have power and staff and money and whatever, and they help you, you're down here, they're up here, and they help you. And then like you come to the door and you leave and you're like, great, I got help. Solidarity is like, we're on the same page, we're sort of equals, and I will fight for you and you'll fight for me and we'll share our limited resources, and more of us, we get stronger, right? And we try to explain that to people, like that's what a union is, that's how we operate. And we happen to have this one lawyer. We try to like minimize it. And there's this lawyer guy and he's great and he's so helpful. And we have this like weekly thing and you can ask them for information to help inform your strategy and how we collaboratively come up with organizing strategies to solve your problem. When we're able to kind of explain that to people out the gate, we usually can kind of like, they understand that getting the information from the lawyer is just like part of a bigger picture. And I've found that like we usually can sort of sustain longer term relationships with people and actually sort of recruit and onboard and all that crap. When people just jump in, because like on our Facebook and our website and everything now, like it's just, you know, legal, like recurring events, like legal help desk, talk to a tenant attorney. When people come through the door that way, that's when it's harder for us to, you know, be like, we're not a legal clinic. So I don't know how much more I have from that. We have, there's been I'd say a little bit, so even internally sometimes, so in our Slack workspace, the lawyer's in there and again, he's dope. Like he actually recently, he got so tired of people being like, Alex, what's the law? What's the law? What do we do? Is it legal? Like, because we've tried to like, just be like, it may be legal and it's still bad and we still need to organize. Like he himself, he finally changed his profile picture to this like really funny looking, like, it says like laws aren't real with like weird graphics around it. It's like really funny actually. He just was trying to signal like, kind of like fuck off, like laws aren't real. They're made up, like they're made up ruling class weapons against us at the end of the day. And sometimes they work to our benefit if we're strategically smart about how we utilize them. So he's gotten like, he just finally was like, fuck it, I'm just gonna, laws aren't real. How can I help, you know? So that's helped. But even internally often, like we have a channel in our Slack workspace that says legal help desk, and like people will pop in, they'll like join the union and they really just want like access to the lawyer. And they'll pop in and be like, Alex, and they like tag him. And then like, again, he's like burnt out. So a lot of time he doesn't even respond. He's just like, I got shit to do, dude. And like, and then people, again, I think piggybacking off of, I think what Elliot was saying, that another drawback to this is that sometimes, again, because he's burnt out, because like he can't guarantee that he's helpful at all, that like any of us may actually know already, oh, that's a habitability issue. That's because like we've all learned a shit ton about tenants' rights in California. So we might be like, well, actually Santa Barbara has this law where if they didn't give you the year lease and like got a signature that was rejected, then that nullifies it. And then that would, if you took it to court, it would actually like get dismissed because of the, like, we actually know a lot of shit that Alex does know at this point, and we could probably tell people. But it's that sort of, I think Rose said this one time, of like reverence towards staff and these people. There's a psychology problem, I think, where some people have thought like, oh, as soon as, if I can just get to the lawyer, then like I'm good. So we're still kind of internally combating that sometimes and just being like, let's knock doors and whatever. So I think that's probably it. I mean, oh, and then I guess one really brief case study thing. We had somebody who, and this just to kind of maybe drive the point home, that issue between like people's sort of faith in like law, lawyers, sort of this formal professionalized stuff. There was somebody that was facing at some point, like maybe an eviction, or there was some tensions with the landlord. It was a multi-unit complex, and they contacted us, and I got on the phone with them actually, and like tried to talk through everything with them. And they weren't down to knock doors. They didn't really care what the other tenants were dealing with. They were just like, help me. And so we were kind of like, there's really nothing we can do. And then like 2 months later, they were like, I got this, here's the picture as an unlawful detainer. And like at that point, you do like, you have to engage with the court directly, like you're actually going to get screwed. So we were like, okay, we routed to the lawyer to Legal Aid Foundation. At that point, also confidentiality kicks in. So we couldn't even, like we could be in contact with him, but because he went the legal route and he never went the organizing route, it actually like made it harder for us to even potentially help him. Because like if we would have gotten like, you know, everyone signs a petition saying we want Joe to stay or whatever, like maybe in a court situation, maybe that document would help or something. I don't know. I've never seen that. But because the person was just like, the organizing shit sounds stupid, give me the lawyer, went to the legal route, what ended up happening is, because I guess, I don't know, it's like the courts are fucked up, as well as like, I think the guy just didn't have a great case. Like he lost, he got evicted. So he went with our lawyer, with Legal Aid Foundation. We weren't allowed to know any of the information from that point forward. He didn't want to work with us, he got evicted. So then he went around just being like, the tenants union is fucking trash, the legal aid is trash. So a similar thing that Elliot brought up of just how like it can be really disillusioning and like just kind of screw with people's morale if they go the route they think is really helpful, and they actually find like, yeah, the legal system, sorry, like it's not gonna like work to your advantage all the time. In fact, most of the time it won't. But that's also a situation where like it didn't matter what we said, like the person just didn't, they were like, organize, what do you mean? Like, what would it matter knocking doors and stuff and power in numbers? And I mean, if someone's like opposed to organizing, I don't know what the fuck you're supposed to do about that. So, okay, I think that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. That's a really good example, and I think raises some really good questions and thoughts for newer tenant unions too, because I mean, in Omaha Tenants United, we don't have a lawyer that we work with all the time. We work with legal aid sometimes, but even internally, we'll get caught up of questions of like, hey, this tenant has a case. Is this legal or not? And then we have to step back and be like, does it matter? Is it going to change our strategy if it's legal or not? So I think that's some really good questions that'll probably generate some discussion. And with that, I think I'm going to throw it over to Walt from the Los Angeles Tenants Union.
Hi, everybody. I'm Walt, he, him, from the Vermont Beverly local chapter of the Los Angeles Tenants Union. I also am a part of the outreach committee, specifically our new locals organizing team and the sustainability committee. And now I'm a part of an ad hoc alternatives to lawyers working group. And I would just say, I don't have a whole lot to add because this discussion has been so rich already from the beginning and has covered most of the things. I'm really glad that Cece and Colleen started out with a very clear initial statement that is one of the basic principles that I at least approach this question from, which is, remember that we're at war. And we're on one side, and the side that runs the courts and the legal system is on the other side. And they have the power to set up the system. The way I said, sometimes people say oh, I'm afraid of the law, or the law limits what we can do. I'd say, look, the law is just words written on paper by people who won in the streets the rights to write them and to enforce them. And ultimately, we have to take that power away from them. And so obviously, one key part of the strategy to me is to keep that in mind at all times. But also to keep in mind contradictions, to look at everything dialectically. And even if you don't look, that term doesn't resonate. Nothing is all of either one thing or another. Everything is made up of contradictions. So, and we've talked about that already. The legal system as a system is against us. It's very clearly on the side of private property. It's not that the system is unfair. It's fair to the ruling class, and it's not working badly or broken. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. But on the other hand, there are individuals and individual lawyers who may be comrades, who may work for us. So with us, and part of and help us. And also, even if the system is against us, at times we have to rely on it to defend ourselves. And it's just like looking at the nonprofit industrial complex or the nonprofit service organizations. A lot of people in our organization say, but they're doing a whole lot of good stuff, and we need them, and we need to work with them to get them to do mutual aid and so forth. I said, as individual orgs or individuals, there's lots of good people working in the nonprofits. But as a system, its purpose is to negotiate our defeat, or to sand off the rough edges to keep an exploitative system in place. So we have to bear that in mind, the difference between the system and some individuals that are comrades, and the contradictions in the system that we can exploit and use at times. And another general principle is that, and when you're looking at, like from afar, people say, oh, you people in California or in Oregon have all these tenant protections that we don't have. And that's true. But with the tenant protections come a lot of downsides as well, including the belief that people think that they can rely on that system, that we have to have lawyers and that they are the ones that know how to work the system, that we're bounded by the limits of that system. So, for example, an example of the contradiction is, I don't know, people are probably aware that there's this big battle going on, not only in California, but across the country, of called the, you know, the right to counsel or the right to civil counsel movement, to try to use the history of like the Gideon versus Wainwright decision that opened the way for criminal defendants to always have the right to be represented by counsel, and the obligation of the state to provide that counsel either by public defendant or a court of public defender or a court appointed attorney. And some people say, well, if that's the case in criminal law, then shouldn't that also be the case in civil law, particularly when deprivation of basic necessities of life like housing is at stake? And you know, one can make that argument, and we can cite the things that, like we've already said, is that landlords are almost always represented in court. And that's one reason, aside from the fact that they wrote the laws in the first place, that they usually win and that we often lose, including by default, by not showing up. So that people say, well, an obvious way to rebalance things is for us to have the right to always be represented. And on the one hand, that's true. And on the other hand, is that enough? Or is that going to lead to victory? Because I find, like in California, a lot of times what winning means that we've just negotiated a little more time to lose our housing, and are still then thrust out onto the market because we don't have the money to get sustainable, secure, affordable housing. So everything that we do with the legal system, we try to put into that framework, that it's a part of exploiting contradictions in a system that is run by a capitalist ruling class against us, the working class. And we are working to replace that system. And in the meantime, we're working to throw sand in the cogs, to slow it down, to minimize the harm, and to build a new one from within the ashes and frameworks of the old. So here's what our working group is working on. And well, one thing back at the beginning, just in terms of our history, we may be one of the biggest unions, but we're less than 6 years old. On July 15th, we'll celebrate our 6th birthday. We're still all volunteer. But we started out by doing tenants' rights workshops, and sometimes we still do that. And at first we said, well, let's get one of the tenants' rights lawyers. But when we started with having tenants' rights lawyers give the opening presentation at a workshop, just like with Max said, even if we then switched to organizing, the tone had already been set by the lawyers being the experts who were giving the definitive presentation. So pretty soon we learned, look, we got to switch that around. The lawyers speak last. Tenants and organizers speak first. And we start by saying, what do we need? What is our lived experience? What have we heard about what might work? What do we think might work? And then we bring in the lawyers. Now, we're not always able to manage that exactly, but I think that's just something we learned basically the hard way. And so what our in the meantime, we've also got this, particularly under this crisis thing, this emergency eviction defense program that came out of like COVID eviction defense money to sort of the Right to Counsel Coalition, a local organizing group to demand that right, negotiated with the county and now with the city of LA to provide legal aid in eviction cases or in pre-eviction notice stages, as well as giving money to nonprofit organizers, but not to us. We didn't take, obviously, we didn't take any of that money to do outreach and workshops and tenant education. But lo and behold, guess what? They're swamped, they're overworked, they say that we can't do that because that's outside of our boundaries. Some of them hire new baby lawyers who don't know any better what they're doing and know less than we do or than the tenants do. And all of the sort of not surprising kind of problems. So one of the things that we're doing from the get-go is just basic accountability, saying that we are setting up an accountability system to hold the feet to the fire of these legal aid, legal service providers and these legal organizations that are supposed to be providing services to tenants. Just to demand transparency, accountability, and one of the things we've demanded and are negotiating for is that if the tenant consents to let a tenant union organizer or solidarity caseworker, which is the same thing as what maybe SAC calls counselors, that to be included in the information about the case so that they are protected by the lawyer-client confidentiality. Because one of the things that we find is that once somebody's referred to a lawyer in the legal aid problem, they don't want to talk to the organizers anymore because they say that would violate the attorney-client privilege. And there's a certain element of truth in that, but it's also part of their professional caste training and protection of the priesthood of the law. But if the tenant member signs up from the beginning to say, we want the organizer to be included, or the outreach worker or caseworker, then they could be notified. Then we know about things, including court dates and appearance dates and whether responses were filed and blah, 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 that we can hold them accountable and we can collectivize the process of information and strategy and defense. So that's one thing that we're working on is accountability. Secondly, we're working on collectivizing and making participatory all of our engagements with the legal system as much as we can. We've always tried to do that. We're trying to do it more. When we're preparing for court cases or for defense against an eviction, to have a group of tenants, whether it's from that building or from the local or from across the union or from other people that have had the experience, brainstorm and help pull together the story, the narrative, the facts, among other things. Lawyers, once they're won to the value of this, see that this is important and helpful, but it also helps overcome the fear, is empowering to the tenant, and it extends as well to court support and maybe extra legal kinds of actions and defense. The third thing is we're doing is, all right, let's keep as many people as possible out of the damn legal system, or particularly out of the courtroom as possible, by doing proactive measures of backing off landlords. And this is everything from using these and sharing these draft template letters and response forms, and also extra legal pressure tactics on the landlords to back them off, or to leverage the city whenever we can to get them to intervene, or the county or the state. But to do this, we have to continue to train ourselves, a cadre of organizers and tenants who've been through the experience together to know as much as we can. So we're doing things like doing trainings on how do you do pro per defense, doing trainings on how do you do small claims court, and how do you file responses? How do you how do you deal with master tenants, and all of the different things, and that we're going to continue to do this on as wide a basis as we can, so that we are building up a collective and specific knowledge-based and smarter cadre that is outside of the profession of the law, but informed by it to the extent that we need to be. And then we're thinking about hiring our own lawyer, but not to try to duplicate the legal service organizations, because we would end up in the same mess that they are, being overworked and swamped, and tenants being sort of switched to this kind of service professionalism rather than organizing and power. So that to the extent, we're still looking about this, and we're looking for models from other places around the country and other histories of movement, radical comrade lawyering. But if we do it, it's going to be not to try to set up individual representation on the same model as legal services, but someone who basically oversees the training and helps us do a kind of participatory collective defense model, and advises us on when and under what circumstances we actually need to have professional representation. And maybe we'll take on a few exemplary cases, particularly of the affirmative sort that establishes different precedents. And then the fifth part of what we're doing is kind of in the same spirit that we started out with from Portland, which is clogging up, delaying, shutting down, blockading the system, all of the kind of extra legal tactics that we can to make the system less effective as a oppressive arm of the state backing up landlords. So those are kind of the 5 parts of what our alternative to the law collective is working on right now. But I think I'll leave it at that for now, and then we can switch to discussions, or I can answer questions in the context. Thanks for everything that everybody has shared.
Thank you, Walt. It's super awesome. I always love to hear what Law 2 is doing. It feels like y'all are always on like the front of some new ideas about things to do. So that's super awesome, even though you're only almost 6 years old. But with that, we'll switch to discussion. And so at the town halls, normally we aim to be about 2 hours. So that'd be about like 20 minutes. But if folks want to stay on and have discussion a little longer, we can. I'll have to shut us down at some point because I've got a wedding to get to, but we'll just kind of be flexible. And if anybody does have any questions or wants to get on stack for discussion, if you do have a question, if it's directed to a specific presenter, if you just want to clarify that, or if it's a question for anyone in the group, just let us know so who is to answer. Or like I said, you're welcome to share some of your own examples of how your union deals with the courts. So with that, I think is Jose.
Howdy. Yeah, I love this. It feeds me on very deep levels. And whoever wants to maybe respond to this, I feel like since the organizing convention last year, and a lot of spaces I've been in on this, huge tension between being a service org or helping people with what they need or doing mutual aid or whatever you guys call it, where you help people, and like organizing power. And like it's still there, and all these new groups are there, and there's this like real so many talks about like the ethics, right? We ethically have to help somebody if we can or something like this. And like, I don't know have a clear question here, but like just how have y'all at Omaha or Latu or any other folks, like what's that tension been like for you, and where are you at 6 years in or 2 years in or whatever?
Yeah, I can discuss Omaha a little bit. I think we have kind of similar questions or a model to kind of Sacramento, which is basically that there aren't a lot of lawyers to help tenants, and tenants have really no protections in Omaha. And there's also not really like organizing foundations in anything in Omaha. So people are really unfamiliar with what organizing would look like. And so it really can be like a big hump to get people into kind of an organizing model. And so pretty much anything that is not super time sensitive, almost really anything other than eviction. So getting deposits back, getting repairs done in units, those are honestly the biggest requests that we get. We go from an organizing standpoint with those. But if it's an eviction, we will direct them to legal aid, but we do always try, depending the capacity that we have, we do always try to talk to that tenant first, say like, hey, because you already have an eviction notice, we wouldn't really have time to organize, but also here's a heads up, what legal aid is going to do is they're going to, if you don't have a winning case, they're going to get you a settlement probably where you'll still have to move, but you'll have like 2 weeks to do it. If that's not what you want to do, we can look at other options like doing a physical eviction defense or something, but just so you know, like you're not going to have a lot of legal protection for that. So we'll kind of like talk them through what the landscape is. And we've also built a relationship. We've only got one legal aid organization in the entire state, not just in Omaha. And I think they have 3 or 4 lawyers who handle evictions in the entire state. And so they've got a hotline that they want people to call because they do get all this federal funding. That's how they track things. But their director of their housing program has basically told us, like, if the hotline doesn't work, just call me on my extension. We always reverse that. We always call him first, talk directly to him, get his advice, go through what the case is. And then he will be like, here's what the lawyers are going to tell them to do. So have them call the hotline, but that way we can like prepare with the tenant what is happening before they get to the hotline. And so it does just kind of build that like trust and accountability with the tenant union actually like being there for the tenant, even though we're directing them to legal aid. It doesn't always go that well though. Like sometimes we do just direct a tenant to legal aid if we don't have that much time. And then we generally, if that happens, we lose contact with that tenant forever. But we will also, if we can keep in contact with that tenant, we'll try to show up to their court date if we can, and just kind of be on their side as an advocate, like letting them know if they have any other options besides just settling and moving, or, advocating for them on how they can talk to the lawyers. If that kind of answers the question, there is always still that tension of like, once we send them over to the lawyers, we're probably not going to hear from them again, but sometimes that's just what you have to do to keep people in their homes, or even just give them long enough, because in Omaha, you don't get any notice before the constable shows up to evict you. So on the day that your eviction is granted in court, they could show up that day. They usually show up within 3 days, but they're going to show up within 10 days. And it's not 10 business days. They can show up on the weekend too. So it really is like tenants, if they don't negotiate to be able to have a longer amount of time, the constable is going to show up on their doorstep sometime and they're going to have no idea. So it's really a question of like, that costs tenants a lot of money. And if there's nothing we can do from an organizing standpoint, we want to save that tenant that money that it's going to cost them to, or keep them from having to stay in a shelter while they're finding a new place type of thing. So yeah, if that answers that. Then, go ahead, Walt.
No, I wasn't trying to get
sorry.
the floor. Sorry.
Then we had a question from Erica on how would the union hire a lawyer and who would be the employer? Walt, you might be a person who could answer that for how Latu does it.
Yeah, I was just answering that in chat. We haven't done it yet, so we haven't solved that. But there are 2 or 3 different things. First of all, we're an unincorporated association, and there's nothing that says an unincorporated association couldn't hire somebody. So legally or strictly, we could. The problem is it's in our culture and our ethos that we're all volunteer. So that would require this working group that I'm talking about, when it comes up with a proposal, it will require some talking through and working through whether and how we're going to do that. But secondly, we've talked about not just hiring, if we do it, a single lawyer, but maybe contracting with some specific, with more than one for some specific services, you know, such as the training or supervision and things like this. Thirdly, we may, we have one of our local chapters, our Unión de Vecinos East Side Local, because it was a pre-existing community-based community organization, although a non-traditional one, with a all tenant volunteer board. Occasionally we've used them as kind of a conduit, so that and they're responsive to and a part of our structure. So, but that illustrates another way that you could do it would be through some sort of a fiscal agent, but one that you really entirely trusted as being a part of your move.
Awesome, thanks, Walt. And then we've got Bob, who I think is.
Sorry, mouse died. I'm in the state of Vermont, and I've heard a lot of talk about people not being able to access the court systems to find information. Vermont has an Information Act, so that makes all of our civil and criminal court information public record. So you can either go onto their sites and find the court cases for the day, the next months, any of that. And if you need specific information about the case that is in the courts, you can put in a public records request to any one of the courthouses, and they have to send you that information. And there's steps that can be taken to enforce that to happen. Other than tenants' rights or protections in the state of Vermont, they're written so weak that they barely provide any protections at all. So we're working on that, trying to improve exactly how the tenants' rights laws are written to make them strong enough to actually provide the protections that we need. And as everyone else across the country, we are also trying to improve them by adding to the list of the protections that we have. One way that we've done this, unfortunately, is have to fight through the charter changes, as most of these are charter changes or law changes that have to be done, and that's a tedious, monotonous process. Right now, we're in the middle of it with just cause evictions that started at the beginning of last year. Now it's going to the State House, and we have that fight coming up. Lawyers, the state of Vermont is losing lawyers because there's so many tenant landlord disputes in Vermont that the lawyers have absolutely had enough of it. Most of the lawyers that are here are personal injury lawyers that are taking on these cases only because the basic fact that all the legal aid organizations can do is counsel you to try to keep you from being evicted. They cannot and will not go to court with you at all, period. Doesn't matter what your case is. If it's egregious enough of a case, you are shuffled off to the Human Rights Commission or the Fair Housing Commission in the state to have them investigate your case, and it's at their discretion of whether or not they have the money to be able to take up that case to assist you. Most of the time, if you're fighting against a for-profit landlord, like every state has their certain amount of, here are Bissonets and Handies are the two largest, especially in the city of Burlington, because we're the biggest city in the state of Vermont. They're very hard to fight against, as every other state knows. And I believe Vermont is, other than it being the second smallest state in the US, one of the leading states for being the farthest behind in the times as far as what tenant protections are here or are not here. So we are actually doing research right now as our fight for just cause eviction comes to the State House to find out exactly what other states have for tenant protections that Vermont does not. I think the Information Act is the strongest that we have to help us find out exactly what court cases are going on where. As far as the pandemic and courts starting back up, we won't be going to court until a month after the state opens back up and drops the state of emergency. And we at this point have no clue exactly what court is going to look like for all these evictions. Legal aid here is actually tracking that information and doing their best to try to figure out exactly what those processes are going to be, but they're not written in stone, and it's going to be a huge toss-up to exactly how Vermont's courts are going to be dealing with it. We are trying to talk to our counselors and state officials about the fact that all of these evictions, even across the entire United States, is only going to increase the number of homeless people. The state of Vermont and the city of Burlington do not provide one penny toward housing. They have no long-term housing goals at all for the entire state. So these evictions are going to add to the houseless numbers, and the state has nothing in place to cover any of it. And legal aid certainly has been overwhelmed for years, and lawyers are leaving Vermont. So we're really looking for any assistance I can get on exactly what housing protections y'all have in different states. And I'll put my email in the chat window for you. Thank you.
And Colleen, did you want to touch on that court records bit?
Yeah, thank you. I saw that question come up a while back and I didn't get to it. So we definitely recommend you beg, steal, or borrow court records. So yeah, this goes along the lines of like the law is not real. Also, it's like whatever. But yeah, beg, steal, or borrow that. Here there is a two-tiered system for court records. There's a public, like what's available, and then there is people who you can pay for access to the court records. And so all lawyers have that already. Also, there's a list of other entities that can get that access. So two things, there's a lot of information for us just in the docket. If you get acquainted with how to read the daily docket, there's actually a fair amount of information that's embedded in there. And then from that, you may also be able to sort through and like, yeah, if you have a data head in your crew, like put them on the website, the court website, and or like old school, go in and do court archives work. Yeah, so I would say beg, steal, borrow, and then generate would be the last one. So look what's publicly available and learn and be able to extract the information from there. If there is there is in Oregon kind of a second tier information, which they're like, and I'm not gonna say they're probably like definitely is, but they're like probably is, because that's basically where all the lawyers for all civil cases will file motions and this, that, and the other. Hack that shit. Find a comrade lawyer. Like, look, a lawyer comes and is like, I want to work with you. Be like, great, give us your password now, right? Like, these are the negotiations that we are making. And then I'll add that, right, as a union or as a collective, like have some agreements around who has access to that. You do now have access to tenant information without their consent, right? And there's some, it's a spectrum, I would say, but definitely at least have something that's publicly available or that you're providing to the tenants that you're working with about how they can withdraw consent for you to have access to that information and fucking abide by it. Like, you know, like we are not, yeah, there's a balance for like how much what is publicly available and what we should, yeah, respect around consent to information around who has access to this. And then the last thing I would say, and I know this is really time consuming and a big ask, but it's so worth it, is if your state really locks that information down and you get kicked out or sued or whatever, generate it yourself. Find a way to get people into each of those courtrooms and document it yourself. We would happily talk to you about what that means and how to do it in a like an efficient way, but it's utterly important that we do not let the courts lock us out of this information, because when you begin, right, like you see trends, like all of that stuff. So beg, steal, borrow, generate it.
Yeah, you can also really, you know, I talked about how this information can lead to a lot of great opportunities with outreach, but I failed to mention that like it also allows us to identify more enemies, like, and who is really tearing up communities. Like we've recently found out that not only is this one lawyer who represents a large percent of landlords in town, they're also buying up properties of which they are responsible for evicting tenants from by using LLCs. And that's, you know, really, if we are doing anti-displacement and anti-gentrification work, it helps to know who's doing what. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you. JR has a question for Sacramento.
Hi, can you all hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so Jacob here from Puget Sound. We are a brand new tenant union. We've existed for about a year. We've been knocking on doors for maybe the past 3 or 4 months. So super new. We don't even have like bylaws and stuff yet. And I was struck by what the Sacramento team said about the sort of amount of energy you have to put into counseling, how that can be sort of draining, and how you need a sort of warm handoff process to legal aid. I was curious about what kind of internal organizing, because we don't have any kind of internal structure yet, what kind of internal organizing do you need to basically have, it sounds like you have a dedicated outreach team which contacts people, or maybe I got you mixed up with someone else, but like what's your sort of internal structure for managing the flow of tenants from people who come in seeking counseling to either organizing opportunity or warm handoff?
Yeah, that's an extremely good question. You all hear me? I took out my headset. Okay. Yeah, so what we have is a team that we call like the tenant counseling, or sometimes we call them the intake team. And those people mostly, so we have a Google Voice number and an email that people can call if they are like having issues with their landlord and need help.
Sure, we got that.
And the people who are part of that team are folks that have gotten some training on like tenants' rights stuff. So we have like we're not lawyers, we have like a relatively good understanding of like the eviction process and your rights about habitability and stuff. And so we're like monitoring those calls. We like give them all case numbers and log them in a spreadsheet and text a group chat basically each time we get a new one in and say, hey, we have a new case, it's this number, can anybody follow up with this tenant and see what the deal is? And so we just sort of like rotate responsibility for following up on those cases. And you can kind of get a sense usually from the call of like the severity of the case, I guess. You know, like sometimes people call and they're like practically in tears in the voice message and they're like, I'm going to get evicted in 3 days. And like my landlord comes to my house with a gun every time he shows up to do anything, and I'm terrified of him, you know, and it's like, okay, that's something that probably, let's try and get 2 people to call that person back, maybe spend a little more time on it. Sometimes people call and they're like, yeah, I haven't got my security deposit back, like looking for some advice, thanks, right? And so what we try and do, and I say try because we're definitely not perfect, and especially those calls where people are really desperate are like, can be tough, because oftentimes like people who are in that serious of a crisis like have a tough time like organizing and advocating for themselves. They need a lot of support, and it's so we like, I think we often kind of get ourselves into the weeds of these like really charged cases. But what we try and do is, if someone has a low stakes case and they basically just need some information, we're like, here's, you know, the rights about security deposit, here's a sample letter. If you want us to like read over a letter that you're planning to send to your landlord, like let us know, we're down to help you, and like let us know if your landlord is giving you issues. And we kind of leave it at that, and sort of see if they take the initiative to take the first step. If somebody calls and they're like in an apartment complex and it seems like there's some organizing potential, either because it's like a rent increase and a bunch of people are getting rent increases, or like a widespread habitability issue, or maybe a bunch of people have gotten eviction notices, then we kind of alert like the organizing team, and we're like, hey, it seems like there's some organizing potential. Can somebody who's been doing more organizing team up with somebody who's been doing more counseling and like talk to this person and see if we can encourage them to organize. And then kind of the third case is like, like the sort of like crisis cases where someone is in a really tough spot. They're either like not someone who like has the personal capacity to organize their neighbors, or they don't have neighbors to organize because they're like in a more isolated place. And that's where we try and support them a lot, but also especially if there's someone who like struggles to understand the distinction between a union and a service organization, we try and steer them in the direction of like an org that we think can help them out. And with the warm handoff, there's a couple of things. So one, we just like talk to our the orgs in town and understand, like, for example, there's a legal services in Northern California organization that does like free and low cost legal services. And they have like specific times you have to call to do intake with them to get help. So like we stay in touch with them so we know where those are, and we can tell people not just like call them, but like you have to call them Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, or Friday at 8:30 in the morning to get on their list, right? So tenants sort of know the stuff to do. And like we were talking about in the presentation, we also try and help those people refine their stories. So they're not calling and like talking about 10 different things. They're calling and like the first thing they say is, I got a court summons, I need to file an answer, can you help me? Because that's like what the legal aid can help them with. And then especially if it's like a case where we feel like the tenant has a good chance, we might also email legal services and be like, hey, we talked to this person, they might contact you. Like, this is what needs to happen. And so those are kind of like, that's like the, I would say the framework that we try and operate under, but it's tough. And especially people that are in really tough circumstances and like call back a bench for help, it's hard to be like, you need to be able to advocate for yourself more or find a true service provider organization that can like help you. And I don't have a good answer to like how to do that in a compassionate way that also is mindful of like how much of a drain that can be on your resources as an organization, and how much there's like a direct trade-off between your ability to support organizing that will ultimately make things better for all of us and like support individual case management.
Well, thank you for that. It sounds like we're in the exact same boat. I'll let you know if we figure anything out.
Please do.
Walt, if you want to go ahead and touch on that too. And then I have Kevin with a question after that.
Yeah, just briefly, all that makes sense. And I think particularly that kind of triage aspect, which is implicit in it. But we have a couple of things that we use too. One is that we set up rapid response networks, and these are on usually a signal chain. And first of all, it's a group of people in the union who volunteered to be able to help in terms of crisis response of various sorts, whether it's in person or through counseling. And then when somebody calls in or emails or we've heard about it, then somebody on that thread will start a specific one for that particular case or situation for who wants to and who's able to help with that. And so then that kind of takes it offline, as it were, but to the group of people who are actually working. It may be just 2 people, and then they'll chime in if they need some more help. The other thing is that many of our chapters are switching to what we call tenant solidarity meetings as a place where people come with their problems, rather than insofar as possible, we tell people, can you come to or call in to our next tenant solidarity meeting? And many locals have them weekly. We have one, for example, in my local on Sunday night from 7 to 8. Sometimes it's used to be called tenant Q&A, now maybe tenant solidarity. And there we have 2 or 3 of our solidarity caseworker, counselor sorts there, but increasingly also it's tenants who have rank and file tenants who have come up before with problems and then want to stick around and help other people. So it's a group kind of counseling discussion situation. And this is a way to focus that's the way that we primarily want to work, is in group collectivized ways, and that fits with our strategy, even if it's helping as an individual, but we're doing it as a group. And secondly, it's just smarter, kind of hive mind sharing experience, and it's kind of leadership and information practice sharing for people who are newer to the union, that they can come and listen for a while.
Well, thanks for sharing that.
I had Kevin next.
That kind of addressed some of the question that I had, but especially I wanted to sort of offer a resource, especially for people in Los Angeles. I'm sure you all know Elena Pop at the Eviction Defense Network. And while they may not be the best to sort of integrate with what the unions are doing, sort of letting the unions take the lead, they definitely have been providing trainings and like a real resource for information during the pandemic, especially with the Zoom meetings. Every Saturday morning, they have Atlanta has an amazing eviction process workshop. And I'm gonna upload the PowerPoint that she uses and has been sort of modifying that tells you the whole eviction process. And it sounds like it could really be a resource in what you're doing, where you're trying to train yourselves how to sort of navigate the court system. But my big question is kind of, maybe it's too big to answer, so I'll try to narrow it down. But it seems like one of the big problems going from, people's conception of what politics is, what the legal system is trying to wrap their minds around the difference between having a problem, like an acute problem that you can solve, and then you go back to your normal life. So you like use the political or the legal system to solve your problem, and you go back to your life. You fix your eviction or you move out or whatever, and then you go back to your life, and then everything's okay again, versus like making the transition to realizing that this is kind of a lifelong commitment. And so it sounds like, if my question is specific examples of what people do in different unions, different organizations, do you have like a one-on-one meeting where somebody contacts the union and one of the members talks to them about, we're not a service organ, like do you just do like a one-on-one, like we're not a service organization, we want to get you involved on an ongoing basis. We're not going to solve your problem and then you go away and we forget about you and never see you again? Or do you have like regular onboarding meetings where you kind of have almost like a stock presentation, almost like a pitch that you give people, where you tell them like, this is what we do and this is how we do it, and you can ask questions and everybody has their input? Or it sounds like, well, in Lati you almost do it kind of by osmosis, where people kind of get involved and they kind of just observe the process and they kind of just pick it up as it's already in the swing of things. There's nothing that's really formal. Can some people kind of talk about that and different ideas of, anyway, yeah, that's basically it.
Thanks, Talia. Hi, Stevie, she, her. I am in the in the LA Tenants Union and the Hollywood local, and just want to speak a little bit on what Walt already touched on, that these tenant solidarity meetings not only help show the model that we want people immediately to be brainstorming and collaborating and learning from each other, but also reduces our caseworker time to the point of the presentation that was made earlier, right, regarding individual counseling or whatever it may be. But we do open up the meeting by defining that we're an autonomous member-funded union that fights for the human right to housing. And so we kind of have a response, like a bread and butter response that we give to anybody who emails us or calls the hotline to let them know to come to, in our case, our Wednesday caseworker meetings. But we do have a kind of formal introduction. I mean, formal is the wrong word, but we do explain what the union is and why we exist. I will be candid. We're still struggling with people being like, okay, thanks for talking about my problem. Bye. But I think that that's we'll get some of those, and some of them, to Walt's point, will stick around. So I hope that helps. I can send you the script if you'd like, Kevin.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
And I'll open it if anybody else has ideas about that, but I think that is one big area of like potential and also struggle for tenant unions is, how to get people involved in the union is a longer process as opposed to just, taking a tenant case, providing us like that service to helping them, and then we never see them again. And I think in Omaha, we've really struggled with that in the past year. And it will be interesting as we start going back to meeting in person to seeing how much of that was just the pandemic, people not having time or energy or not wanting to meet on the internet. Because we've had one meeting in the park since since people have started getting vaccinated and it's been warmer, and we had way more people show up to it than we do to our Zoom meetings. So it might just be that the problem has been largely the past year, but I think there's also like, even when we go back to in person, it's still going to be a challenge of figuring that out, because now like in Omaha, we've got like 120 members who all signed up online during the pandemic, who we haven't been able to get out to anything yet, that we're going to have to be doing a lot of like catch up if we do want to get those members involved. And we're really thinking that like in-person meetings and like one-on-one calls and meetings with all of new members is kind of the way to go. And this is like, again, people who have signed up online as opposed to like tenants who we do casework with, although sometimes those are the same. Sometimes tenants will do casework, they'll sign up to pay dues, but we still won't see them again. So there's an overlap there. But yeah, it's going to be a lot of playing catch up, because we would have like onboarding meetings once a month with our members where we would actually like text everyone who had signed up that month, text or call, and we would only get like one person out of like 10 or 20 showing up. And so again, that's just going to be seeing if maybe people didn't want to do a Zoom call, or maybe those onboarding meetings, we also weren't having people stick around after the onboarding meeting. So like maybe the content of those meetings wasn't good enough. So it will definitely be like something to figure out. And sorry, I missed the chat. I see Colleen and Stack for it.
This may be super obvious, and so I apologize, but the thing that we have found really useful, because we also, even not being a union, we are a member collective, and like we run an organization and all of that stuff, and that's kind of the invisible work that people don't see and don't necessarily know they want to be involved in. But the thing that we have found the most useful in terms of both tenants that we connect with at the court or outreach to through the court stuff, or people who find us on Twitter and is having a list of like 3 tasks that are available to do immediately. Like you get that phone call and you're like, great. And so our 3 are Court Watch, right? We're like immediately on board to Court Watch. It's 5 days a week. You can do it once a month. You can do it 5 days a week, right? Like as many people can be doing it at a time. So there's like no limit. So, but that is definitely, it's a time commitment, but having that available so that we're like, great, you can start tomorrow. And then letter delivery is another one. And then signing up for a mutual aid network, which is a little bit more touch and go. But what we have found is like, if we can get people immediate, like the second they express an interest, give them something to physically do that they are able to have a little bit of their own control over how and when. doing that, like delivering letters, like eventually they'll be like, so what's this letter about? Or how did you find out? Right? Like it grow. And then you're like, oh, here's all of the other work that we're doing on the back end. And please come get involved. And then we definitely get way more, like if somebody's just like, I'd like to come to your member meeting, and we send them the Zoom link, it's like, but if it's somebody who has had and then also the court disruption, which we didn't really talk about, we made our court disruption not member-based, so anybody could join and we let them participate. And then, so through court disruption, letter delivery, and court observation, we hook people in because it's something that they can do immediately. And then they have questions. They have so many questions and we're there to answer it. So that's not the same thing, but I think it's just really useful to remember that, like, when like that teeny bit of like feeling like it's there, like that they're involved in it already from day one, as opposed to like, I definitely have found that when I show up to meetings or some of the tenant drop-in stuff that Cece's been doing, like, I feel like I'm a learner in that process. And so I'm not like immediately feeling like I can walk away and be like, oh, this is something that I'm a part of. I'm like, I'm watching and learning Cece do something, which is great for me. I enjoy that as a learner, but I'm not like tomorrow I'm going to wake up and run my own tenant, my own workshop or webinar, but I know tomorrow I can wake up and deliver that letter or deliver that gallon of milk or whatever. So that's a useful way, I think, of organizational structure.
I think you're really good advice, Colleen. And I think, unless I missed anyone, I think Stack is empty. So I'll do a little last minute call if anyone has anything. Otherwise, thanks everybody so much for being here today. This was a really, really great discussion, especially thanks to all the presenters who I know many of them have had to hop off already, but if they ever watch the recording, they will see our big thank you. And yeah, again, it takes us a little bit sometimes because the video's got to convert and then somebody's got to be available to do any editing needed and upload to YouTube, but it will be uploaded at some point. And again, let me post the agenda in here because it, one more time, has the links to our email list, our convention survey, and there are also some other information about Attune down on the last page of it, and some ways to get involved there. Our Slack link and everything is all in that document if you do need any of it after this. Otherwise, our next town hall is always on the second Saturday, which I think is July 10th. And Latu is going to be doing a presentation on language justice for us. So that will be another great one. And if anybody does have ideas for town halls that they would really think are valuable or that you would like to present on, please feel free to get in touch. After July, our schedule is open as of right now. So we're still looking for an August topic if anyone's interested. And otherwise, hope to see you all there. And yeah. Well, thanks, everyone.